Hello readers by eyes and by ears, this is Mari Chan and welcome back to my channel. Today we are continuing with Copper Coins but commencing the second volume of this Tong Qian Kanshi by Musuli, and I am super excited about it. Just a quick update. So for several of the chapters, or really the majority of the book, you were given them all in advance just for my break time after my surgery. So I'm not 100% sure how we will commence doing this release, if it will be weekly or if it will be every other day or what, because I'm still recording this at a time when I don't know if my recovery period is going to be 1 or 2 weeks. But I just want to say that more than likely this series is going to go either it's going to go back to releasing 1 video a week, or it's going to start off releasing more of the videos and then transition to going back to 1 video a week once I've recovered and can continue reading Jiang. So anyway, without rambling any further, let's go ahead and get started. I hope you all enjoy. Arc 2, Nameless. In the summer of the 23rd year of the Qianxi era, a dragon fell in Huameng County, Guangdong. It stood as tall as a person and measured several hundred feet in length. Ensnared within a net, its skin and flesh were cleaved open. Within it, no spine was found. As the officials and townsfolk gathered to witness the scene, a mighty downpour began. In the surging waves, the dragon was swept out to sea and disappeared without a trace. Chronicles of Huameng County. Chapter 15. Shr-toe Zhang. Luomei Street was Wolong County's busiest avenue. Its name came from the red plum trees planted between the houses and buildings lining both sides. During winter, especially on snowy days, the scarlet petals of the plums fell onto the white snow, dotting the entire street with specks of red. This gorgeous, scenic view had become one of Wolong County's most famous attractions, hence the name Luomei, falling plums. The area boasted inns, pawnshops, eateries, and wine houses, along with a variety of other shops. There were several silk and fabric stores nestled between the cosmetics and jewelry shops. Xian was difficult to please. He didn't want to be seen by passers-by as he coiled around Xuanmin's wrist, but he also didn't want his face entirely covered by the wide sleeve. He insisted that the monk adjusted just enough to show his eyes, but then he would stretch and move his head and tail, mussing the sleeve. He had to badger Xuanmin into fixing it constantly. What well-adjusted person would walk down a road while fiddling with their sleeve over and over? Xuanmin humored Xian with a few words at first, but as the dragon grew more restless, Xuanmin glanced down and shook out his sleeve to cover Xian entirely. No matter how Xian thrashed around on Xuanmin's wrist, Xuanmin didn't let him out again. Xian lay still in the dark for a while, then began leaving bite marks on each of Xuanmin's fingers, from the thumb to the little finger. Eventually, he clamped down and refused to let go. Xuanmin's finger twitched a few times, but to no avail. In the end, Xuanmin decided to carry on as if his fingers were unbitten. Xian wasn't even that upset. He had a bad temper and was accustomed to throwing his weight around, so he never reined himself in. But that didn't mean he'd fly into a rage over every trivial thing. He just wanted to provoke Xuanmin. When they'd first been getting to know one another, Xian had been driven by the indignation he'd felt when Xuanmin had captured him. Over time, his constant mischief became habitual, as if he couldn't feel at ease without causing trouble for Xuanmin. Though they'd faced danger together and Xian's initial resentment had faded, he couldn't resist acting out from time to time. Perhaps it was because Xuanmin, unlike anyone Xian had ever met, was absurdly calm and detached. He itched to provoke the monk, to see what he would look like when he lost his composure. Could be I'm just bored and looking for some amusement at the bald donkey's expense. ShooANNE thought. Such moments of fleeting self-reflection were almost unprecedented for this particular wise one. They usually only happened when he was full and had nothing better to do, or when he was ravenously hungry. ShooANNE thought hunger was probably the culprit this time. He lazily lowered his head, watching the tip of his tail swaying with Xuanmin's steps. "Bald donkey, you still owe me a meal," ShooANNE grumbled. Not in the habit of muttering to himself in public, Xuanmin didn't reply. To his surprise, ShooANNE loosened his grip on Xuanmin's little finger. With a shift of his claws, he began scuttling up Xuanmin's wrist, right for his collar. "Can't you hear me?" he said as he climbed. "Then I'll say it into your ear." Xuanmin blinked. ShooANNE's claws, much like his scales, had softened considerably. They caused no pain when they hooked onto Xuanmin's hand, but they did tickle him. This was tolerable when he wasn't moving, but once he started walking, well, it became rather irritating. Xuanmin frowned. The fingers hidden in his sleeve pinched the evil spirit's unruly tail and yanked him back down. ShooANNE narrowed his eyes and dug into Xuanmin's arm, scoring a long line of claw marks as he was dragged downward. Xuanmin's frown deepened as he turned his full focus to ShooANNE. "Since when did I owe you a meal?" he asked in a neutral tone. A passing pedestrian, wondering if the monk talking to himself was a bit off in the head, shot Xuanmin a strange look. However, the icy aura radiating from Xuanmin intimidated the stranger. He hastily lowered his head and scuttled away. ShooANNE felt a surge of resentment. "When you barged into the Jiang family clinic, you ruined my meal. That bookworm went to the eatery at the crack of dawn to buy it for me and almost collapsed from exhaustion bringing it back. Those were their signature dishes. You can't find that flavor anywhere else. I paid for it, but I didn't even get to enjoy 2 bites before you ruined it. Don't you feel even a bit guilty? Shouldn't you make it up to me?" His reasoning was sound, his arguments well-rounded. Could anyone say no to him? If they did, he'd turn the world upside down. Spotting a clothing shop ahead, and noticing how everyone who walked past seemed to duck, Xuanmin decided against saying more. He replied with a nonchalant, turned on his toes, and entered the shop. The owners were a middle-aged couple. The man was busy clacking away on an abacus, while the woman held a copper hand warmer in her arms, her head bowed as she wove what looked like an intricately designed knot. Xuanmin's steps were silent, and his robes gleamed white like clouds or snow. He might have cut an ethereal figure, but it was also easy to mistake him for someone in mourning at first glance. When his white silhouette lashed in the corner of the lady shopkeeper's eye, a jolt went through her still weaving hands. "Oh, heavens! You scared me!" she exclaimed, patting her chest as she looked up. When she saw that the newcomer was a young monk, she froze for a moment, her expression shifting to something uncertain. It was deep in winter, and few were out and about. Moreover, the day had been overcast since the morning, and there had been rumors of a strange, thunderous downpour by the river earlier, complete with towering white waves. The dark clouds looming overhead once more, a few pedestrians on the streets further quickened their pace. The couple's shop had yet to make a single sale that day. They finally had a customer, only to discover it was a monk. What good was a monk? The lady shopkeeper automatically looked at Xuanmin's hands. He wasn't carrying an alms bowl, so he wasn't there to beg. However, her expression didn't brighten much. Monks held a somewhat peculiar status these days thanks to the current state preceptor. Everyone knew the state preceptor was a monk, and an exceptionally powerful one at that. Rumors spoke about his extraordinary abilities, that he was capable of overturning the heavens with the flip of his hand. Most importantly, he'd lived for a long time. So long that no one could say for certain just how old he was. He'd served 5 generations of emperors, and his tenure as state preceptor alone spanned over a century. Ordinary citizens could see the state preceptor at most once a year, during the annual winter solstice ceremony at Mount Tai. A grand procession would travel from the capital to the foot of the mountain, and townsfolk along its path could catch a fleeting glimpse of the man, though they had to be discreet about it. The state preceptor always wore a silver beast mask, while his voluminous robes and crimson kasaya concealed his hands and feet. His face remained hidden, making his age impossible to discern. Some swore that he wasn't human at all. They said that, though his face and limbs were hidden away, looking at his neck was enough to prove he wasn't an old man. When people aged, wrinkles that were impossible to hide formed on their necks. Living a long life was one thing, but living over a century without any signs of aging? That was downright terrifying. Others claimed they'd seen the state preceptor during a procession, and his neck had shown wrinkles then. Still, they didn't think he looked elderly, more like a middle-aged man. Another group believed that the state preceptor had been replaced multiple times over the years, but the mask kept anyone from noticing. In any case, opinions varied, and it was difficult to separate truth from fiction. Commoners always held a certain reverence for the mysterious and the unknown. However, the state preceptor was not only enigmatic in appearance and age, his personality was also said to be eccentric and mercurial. Rumors about him abounded in the capital. Some said that he was currently observing a vow of silence. He'd ceased speaking, his demeanor as cold as the snow on Mount Tianshan. His attendants were left in a constant state of anxiety, unsure whether they were doing the right thing or not. There were also claims that he practiced the dark arts. Every few years, he'd take in a wise and promising child or two, only for them to vanish without a trace. Some speculated that they'd been transformed into medicinal puppets or other sinister creations. At times, it was said, a faint scent of blood lingered around his residence. The spine-chilling tales left people too frightened to imagine the details. These rumors had no clear source. After all, no one dared to gossip about the state preceptor using their real names. Those who'd publicly opposed him in the past had all met untimely ends. That had only made the commoners more inclined to believe the rumors. Moreover, although the state preceptor had quelled many natural and man-made disasters, each time he resolved a crisis, strange events followed. This only deepened the people's fear of him, and many considered him a demonic monk. They feared that he might succumb to some dark ailment one day, and then no one would be able to control him. He had been notably absent for this year's winter solstice ceremony. Some claimed he'd met with a great disaster and been forced into secluded cultivation. At best, he was dealing with some thorny issues, and at worst, his absence from the ceremony suggested a life-or-death situation. Perhaps his lifespan was nearing its end. The common folk secretly rejoiced at this possibility. Decades ago, before the rumors about the state preceptor had spread, the populace had treated monks well, and temples across the nation had overflowed with incense. Once the rumors began to circulate, however, the reputation of monks became somewhat negative. When people needed rituals performed or evil spirits exorcised, they grudgingly sought out temples for assistance. Still, most people preferred not to interact with monks and avoided them altogether on an average day. Now that one had come to their tailor's shop, they couldn't just turn him away, and Xuanmin was rather handsome. When the lady shopkeeper's gaze swept over his face, her expression softened a little. She set her knot on the counter and rose to greet him. Why would a monk come to a tailor shop for monk's robes? She wondered. Shifu, are you here to purchase some garments? Xuanmin offered no explanation. Was all he said before scanning the clothing on the display. The lady shopkeeper clutched her hand warmer. This monk was acting so coldly she couldn't find it in herself to be warm toward him. She nudged her husband, who was still clacking away on the abacus. "Stop fiddling with that thing. We'll handle the calculations later. Go attend to our guest." Her husband was the languid type. He rubbed his lower back and looked up. "What kind of style are you looking for, young Shr-fu?" His speech was slow and measured. "We've never made monk's robes in our humble shop before, but if you need one, we can have one tailored for you overnight. We'll just need to take your measurements." "No need," Xuanmin replied. The lady shopkeeper stared, always with the 1 or 2 word answers. How was she supposed to conduct business like this? It was clear that Xuanmin had never set foot in a shop like this before, and he seemed like a wandering ghost standing there in his white robes. He didn't bother to pick and choose. He just casually rifled through the sleeves of a few nearby winter overcoats. He glanced at their lengths and roughly recalled the height of Xuexian's human form, intending to pick a few items at random. The dragon coiled around his wrist wasn't having it. "That thing's thick enough to block gaps in city walls," complained Xuexian. "If I wore that, I'd be rolling on the ground like a ball. I don't want it. Buy it and wear it yourself." He knew he couldn't be too unruly in the shop, so he kept his voice down, the words muffled as they traveled through the folds of Xuanmin's robes. The lady shopkeeper held her hand warmer tighter and studied Xuanmin for a moment. Her gaze traveled from his hands to his winter coats. Suddenly, she understood. "Are you buying these for someone else?" Said Xuanmin, still focused on the clothing. "Do you have any preferences or requirements?" the lady shopkeeper asked. "If I may ask, who are you buying it for? We might be able to recommend a few items." Xuanmin's gaze fell on a particularly garish overcoat. Its colors were bright enough to make anyone's eyes bleed. Recalling Xuexian's ability to throw a fit over every single little thing, Xuanmin offered a concise description. "Someone who chases people around like a pheasant and pecks at them." Neither Xuexian nor the lady shopkeeper knew what to say to that. The easygoing shopkeeper pointed at the lurid coat. His eyes squinted in a perpetual smile. "Shr-fu, the one in front of you is quite nice. Bright colors and a fresh design." The jacket was a mishmash of colors, as if it had been stripped straight off of a pheasant. It was, indeed, a perfect match. "You must have a death wish," Xuexian muttered venomously. When Xuexian placed his silver on the counter, the lady shopkeeper's mouth twitched. "This monk must not leave the temple much," she thought. "He's completely clueless about market prices." In this county, buying a house cost just over 20 taels of silver. Who would throw that much money at just 3 pieces of clothing? Without comment, her husband picked up a small copper scale to weigh the silver and instructed his wife to count out the change for Xuanmin. As Xuanmin rested his hand on the counter, Xuexian happened to notice a half-finished knot lying there. He stared at the knot for a moment, then poked Xuanmin with his claw. While the couple was distracted, he swiftly climbed up to Xuanmin's neck. "Now this is a surprise. Look at that knot. Doesn't it resemble the pattern carved at the base of the stone lock?" Xuexian whispered. That stone lock was hefty, so carrying it around everywhere was impractical. Xuanmin had borrowed some simple tools from the Lu family to make a rubbing of the pattern at its base instead. Since Xuexian spent so much time in Xuanmin's pouch that he practically treated it as his own nest, he stuffed it with anything and everything, including the paper with the rubbing and the iron tags he'd pulled from the riverbed. Fortunately, they were all small and lightweight items. Otherwise, Xuanmin's monk's robe would have been torn open. Xuanmin coolly pulled the paper from his pouch and compared it to the knot. The pattern on the paper was strange and resembled a totem. It was a circular design with a clawed creature perched on top, a bat or something similar perhaps, and swirling cloud patterns below. Of course, a woven knot couldn't look exactly like a carving. The carved creature had a primitive ferocity to it, while the woven knot was rounded and much gentler. At first glance, it wasn't a perfect match, but closer inspection proved them quite similar. Xuanmin and Xian had never seen such a pattern before and were prepared for a difficult investigation, but to their surprise, they'd already made some progress. "What is this knot used for?" Xuanmin asked. He put the paper away and tapped the counter. The lady shopkeeper had been counting out copper coins as per her husband's instructions. "Oh, it's a blessing knot for peace and good fortune." Upon raising her head, she noticed Xuanmin's expression. "Not something you see often, right? I learned this pattern a few years ago. I haven't seen it anywhere else, but it really works. My sons avoided quite a few disasters wearing it, though the knot itself keeps breaking." "Where did you learn the pattern?" "From Shr-toe Zhang's wife," the lady shopkeeper replied. Realizing that Xuanmin might not be a local, she elaborated. "Shr-toe Jahng is a famous stonemason in our county, known for his exquisite craftsmanship. Quite a few officials from the capital have invited him there. His wife is fairly talented herself and enjoys weaving beautiful trinkets. I learned it from her." Shr-toe Jahng. Shr-toe. Stone. Xian thought of the stone lock submerged in the river. Stone here, stone there. It was not just a coincidence, surely. Xuanmin picked up on it too. He picked up the wrapped clothes as well as the copper coins. "Where does this Shr-toe Zhang live?" "Head east along the street and turn into Hu-Gua Alley. There's a pile of stone material in front of the gates." Huizhou Prefecture was renowned for its carvings. Many came here looking for skilled artisans to carve all sorts of trinkets. So the lady shopkeeper found nothing suspicious about his queries and readily told him the answer. Unlike Xian, Xuanmin had no problem with directions. A couple of turns later, he arrived at Hu-Gua Alley. The lady shopkeeper's description was apt, and the residents jumped out right away. Standing at the entrance of the lane, he saw a compound with a small mountain of stone materials piled near the gates. He walked up to the gates and knocked with the brass knocker. However, there was no response from within. "Are you also going to see Shr-toe Zhang, young Shifu?" a middle-aged man asked as he walked by. "He's not home. I live next door, and his place has been empty for over half a month. It's always dark and silent inside. Maybe some out-of-town official invited him for a job again." The man continued on, muttering to himself, But his wife hasn't been home either. Perhaps they're out visiting their relatives?" He paused. Who knows? In any case, knocking won't help. Several groups have come looking for him over the past 2 weeks, and they all left empty-handed. You might want to come back another time." He glanced at the sky and hurried off without another word, quickly entering the gates of a nearby compound. Xuanmin watched the man go before turning away. He remained outside the Shr-toe Zhang's gates, his arms loose at his sides. Xian was feeling uncomfortably cooped up and twitched his claws. Seeing that no one was around, he poked his head out of Xuanmin's sleeve and gulped down some fresh air. Xuanmin brushed at Xian's slender tail with his fingers and frowned. "Why are you suddenly burning up?" "I'm not just hot. I feel bloated, too," Xian replied. His long tongue hung limply from his half-open mouth. He looked almost lifeless. The sensation was a familiar one. The last time he'd experienced it was on Funto Island, which had led him to reclaiming his true form at last. Now that feeling had resurfaced, there was no way he could ignore it. With his tongue still lolling, Xian slurred to Xuanmin. "Do me a favor and either break down the door or climb over the wall. There's something hidden in that guy's house. And once we're inside, find an empty room to put me down in. Bring the new clothes with you," Xian added after a moment's thought. Xuanmin already had a hand on the gate of the Jiang residence, but he paused. "Why?" Xian chuckled dryly. "My body's swelling so much that I might not be able to maintain this form. If I don't transform into a human, I'll revert to my true form, and half of Wolong County will be flattened. You'll end up as a pancake, little monk." Xuanmin blinked. Whether Xuanmin in particular would end up as a pancake remained to be seen, but Xue Xian found himself being dragged into the Jiang family courtyard by the tail regardless. "If it weren't so uncomfortable, you'd be getting pelted by thunderbolts right now," Xue Xian threatened. He probably meant to look menacing, but with his head spinning from the heat, his words came out listless and whiny. Even his attempts to bare his claws resulted in only ineffectual twitching. He wasn't intimidating in the slightest. Xuanmin had been half unconscious back in the river and missed Xue Xian's majestic ascent into the clouds. Looking at this skinny, puny dragon now, it was hard to imagine him as a fearsome creature. Xuanmin had planned to enter the compound and find a random room in which to set the tiny dragon down, but once he actually stepped into the courtyard, he changed his mind. Xue Xian was so overheated that he'd lost all sense of time, and his mind was in a fog of confusion. He noticed that Xuanmin had stopped just inside the gate. Perhaps he'd seen something and was assessing the situation, for he made no move to proceed further. The grip on Xue Xian's tail released, and Xuanmin placed him back on the bony jut of his wrist. However, Xue Xian's claws were weak and unable to keep their grip. He couldn't even lift his head, let alone coil himself around Xuanmin's wrist. The moment he was placed there, unable to hold on, he began sliding down Xuanmin's hand. At least Xuanmin's skin proved to be cool. Though Xue Xian seemed about to burst into flames, he found some relief pressing himself to it. After slipping down twice, Xue Xian felt Xuanmin pull him elsewhere. He was now cradled in Xuanmin's palm, preventing him from falling to the ground. Palms tended to be warmer due to their link with the fire within the heart. Xue Xian squirmed a few times, finding this spot less pleasant than Xuanmin's wrist, and drowsily sought to move elsewhere. Drawn instinctually to the coolest area possible, Xue Xian soon wound himself around Xuanmin's fingers and wove through the gaps between them. Xue Xian snaked around the root of each finger, capitalizing on every bit of coolness he could find. The tip of his tail dangled from Xuanmin's little finger, and his head pressed against Xuanmin's thumb. The soft scales of his belly and back brushed against Xuanmin's skin. Xuanmin frowned slightly and glanced downward. When he saw Xue Xian's drowned worm appearance, he sighed in resignation and let him be. Shr-toe Zhang was a stone mason through and through, and his courtyard was crowded with even more stones than the area outside the gate. Heaps of rocks of varying sizes and heights almost encircled the yard, leaving only a small gap by the entrance just wide enough for one person to squeeze through. As for why Xuanmin had paused after entering the courtyard, these were no ordinary stones. With the exception of a few unfinished or discarded pieces, most of the stones in the yard had been carved into mythical beasts. Xuanmin scanned them, identifying a single-horned animal resembling a deer or horse known as a tianlu, a beast resembling a lion or tiger called a bixie, and a thick-maned, hornless creature known as a taoba. Every single one was a fierce beast with the power to dispel evil and misfortune. Shr-toe Zhang's craftsmanship was extraordinary. His statues were both exquisite and lifelike. The larger ones stood as tall as a person, and the smaller ones were about waist high. Some were gazing down, while others stared straight ahead. Some had their eyes half closed, and others remained wide-eyed. All of them faced the gate. Between these stone beasts were crammed smaller statues of coiled tortoises, celestial dogs, and the like. The sculptures were packed so densely the effect became almost stifling. Most people stepping into the courtyard would probably be scared out of their wits at the sight. Whether they could actually ward off any evil wasn't clear, but they'd certainly work for scaring people away. That was the real odd part. It was normal for a stone mason living off his craft to showcase some of his sculptures and skills, but to choose a display so terrifying? That gave one pause. Xuanmin scrutinized the moss-covered stone slabs beneath the statues, then reached out to touch the nearest sculpture. The moss on the stone slabs suggested that these statues hadn't been placed here for long, maybe just a month or two. Some of the sculptures were newly carved, and though they appeared robust and lively, the details suggested they'd been crafted in haste. If the goal was to attract visitors, such hastily finished pieces would never have been given such a prominent display. "Why are you still standing there like an idiot?" Xuanmin mumbled. "I'm about to burst." Without even looking at him, Xuanmin flicked his thumb against Xuanmin's head. "An array has been placed in the courtyard. If I walked forward, you'd probably suffocate from bloating before finding a house to rest in." "Ugh, just speak normally. Don't mess with my head while doing so. I'm already dizzy enough without you making it worse." Xuanmin glanced down this time. Xuanmin wasn't exaggerating. It would be an understatement to say that his dragon scales were scalding hot. If the one holding him weren't Xuanmin, but the likes of Jiang, Shr-neeng, or Lu Nianti, they'd have screamed in pain and shaken him off by now. It was like having a cup of hot tea spilled on your hand, right onto the thin skin between your fingers. It was a mystery how this evil spirit hadn't burnt himself stupid by now. Noticing that Xuanmin kept seeking out cooler spots, Xuanmin figured he must have been in considerable discomfort. He placed the fingers of his other hand on Xuanmin's scaly skin. Xuanmin, barely conscious, let out a contented sigh and shifted his body, pressing his head against Xuanmin's fingertips. He didn't mind having his head touched anymore. Xuanmin sighed to himself and began walking around the courtyard, following the circle of stone carvings. He hadn't noticed it when observing from a distance, but up close he saw that there were small, thumb-sized stones scattered among the intimidating stone beasts. They had looked like ordinary pebbles, but he realized now that they were miniature stone tablets. The craftsmanship in this region was renowned, not only for its exceptional intricacy, but also for its artisans' ability to carve anything and everything. The intricate designs could be etched on surfaces as small as a grain of rice. Likewise, these tiny tablets were exquisitely detailed. Upon each tablet was a fierce, lifelike face of a beast, each ear, horn, nose, and mouth meticulously carved. Even the eyes were carefully dotted with tiny pupils. Below each beast's face, in minuscule script, were 3 characters. Shigandang. Shigandang were spirit stones used to dispel evil and misfortune. They were commonly placed at the entrances of residences, inauspicious locations, or street intersections to drive away malevolent spirits. In some regions, they were also called stone generals. Regardless of the name, typical households would only place 1 or 2 Shigandang at key locations, such as the Death Gate or areas with heavy yin energy. It was unusual to see them densely packed around stone statues as they were in the Zhang family courtyard. There were approximately 20 Shigandang of various sizes in Shr-toe Jiang's yard, obstructing 7 of the 8 directions. The only open path led to the gate, making the message clear: "Return from whence you came." It turned out that the menacing stone creatures scattered across the courtyard were a facade to frighten the ignorant onlooker. The true source of protection lay in the unassuming Shigandang. "Your breathing is so loud," Xuanmin muttered drowsily. In his daze, he somehow still found it in himself to complain. Xuanmin paused for a moment. "If I'm not mistaken, the loud breathing is coming from you." Xuanmin was a master at blaming others for his own faults, but Xuanmin didn't bother arguing further. After all, Xuanmin's heaving, bellow-like breaths were evidence enough of his discomfort. Xuanmin hung his head in silence for a while before he processed that the heavy breathing was his. The reason it was so hard to ignore was that their surroundings were unnaturally silent, as if they'd been trapped within the courtyard, or someone had deliberately suppressed all other sounds in the house. Xuanmin rubbed ShooANNE's head with his cool fingers. Ignoring the stone beasts meant to divert his attention, he swept his gaze over the circle of Shigandang twice. Just as I thought, he murmured. What do you mean, just as you thought, huh? ShooANNE might have been both physically and mentally useless, but he stubbornly kept his ears open. Pass out already. Okay, I'm gonna read that again. Pass out already. Xuanmin pressed a finger against what might have been ShooANNE's ear. The more restless the wise one became, the hotter his body grew. Xuanmin felt like ShooANNE might spontaneously combust at any moment. Hopefully, he wouldn't actually explode. ShooANNE reached out an unsteady claw to scratch Xuanmin's hand, but he couldn't quite reach it. He no longer had the strength to cause trouble. What Xuanmin had noticed was that the Shigandang were arranged in a specific order. The eyes of the beastly faces on the tablets weren't quite the same. Some had their eyes wide open, some had them half closed, and others had theirs completely shut. The progression from closed to open eyes indicated the sequence he needed to follow. Xuanmin reached for the string of copper coins at his waist. As his fingers brushed the edge of the coins, the wound on his finger began to bleed again. A few drops of blood were enough to make the coins emit a soft, resonant hum. It had been a long time since he had used these coins. Each time he touched them, a strange sensation of aversion would swell within him, not toward the coins themselves, but toward something else he couldn't quite place. He'd always avoided using them unless it was absolutely necessary. It wasn't until he awakened the coins with his blood in the underground tomb on Shr-toe Island that he broke free of those feelings. With use came familiarity. The technique for making use of them came naturally, as if it were ingrained in his body rather than his memory. How many times had he done this? To be so familiar with their workings. One by one, he confirmed the positions of the Shigandang. Northeast, due west, due north, southwest. Each time he moved to a new cardinal direction, he flicked a coin with his index finger. Clang! The sound of the coins wasn't the usual metallic clink, but more like the deep, resonant toll of an ancient bell. With each chime, the Shigandang in the corresponding position shattered with a sharp crack. A fragment of broken stone inadvertently rolled into the wrong position, clinking against the clawed foot of a bestia's statue that stood as tall as a person. The bestia's half-closed eyes slowly opened wider, and its head tilted. Its hefty chest began to rise and fall faintly, as if it had come to life. Just when it raised its front paw, arched its back, and prepared to pounce, Xuanmin calmly stepped to the next position and flicked another coin. Clang! The bestia that had been poised to strike turned back to stone, frozen in its pouncing stance. After 8 measured chimes, all the Shigandang lay shattered on the ground. In an instant, faint sounds filtered into the courtyard, and the entire house seemed to come alive. The stone beasts moved aside by themselves, opening up several paths leading to the short corridor, the side rooms, and the main hall. As the paths opened, the sound of frightened sobbing came from the direction of the main hall. Xuanmin's brow furrowed, and he strode swiftly into the main hall. Behind an intricately carved screen stood a short, pot-bellied man, trembling as he stared at Xuanmin. His face was ashen with fear, his posture guarded. He clutched a sword that was around 2 feet long, but it was an unusual one. It wasn't made of bronze or iron. Instead, it had a skeletal hue, as if it had been carved from the bone of some creature. Uh-oh. A searing pain shot through Xuanmin's palm, and the grip around his fingers suddenly loosened. Deafening roars erupted in their ears, startling the short man so badly that he fell to the ground. The sword in his hand quivered like a leaf in the wind. Boom! A massive black shadow loomed behind Xuanmin. Golden light flashed as thunder clouds churned above, and 4 bolts of lightning streaked down from the heavens. 4 deafening bangs sounded, one to the east, one to the west, one to the south, and one to the north. Each lightning bolt struck around the man with precision, narrowly missing him. He was so terrified that tears streamed down his face, and a wet stain spread across his pants. In the thunderous howl, a majestic dragon's head emerged from behind Xuanmin, carrying the might and ferocity of a tiger's snarl. It thrust itself before the man, its voice menacing. "Who gave you such daring? To carve a sword from the bone of a dragon? The man's eyes crossed in terror, and he fainted on the spot. Seeing that he'd successfully frightened the man into unconsciousness, Xian turned his massive dragon head to Xuanmin, his expression nonchalant. "I was about to suffocate in there." The tiny dragon that had spent all day coiled around Xuanmin's wrist, small enough that its tail could be pinched between 2 fingers, had transformed into this. Anyone would need a moment to adjust. Xuanmin stared at the enormous dragon head that was nearly half his height, then glanced at the dragon's coiled body, large enough it might burst from the courtyard. His expressionless face froze as solid as ice. Xuan's massive head remained still as he studied Xuanmin's face, catching a flicker of something complex in the monk's otherwise unconcerned eyes. He squinted and let out a snort. "Are you pretending to be calm?" Xuanmin shot Xuan a sidelong glance. Even when transformed, this wise one's tone remained exactly the same. "Did I scare you so much your legs buckled?" Xuan raised one of his sharp claws and leisurely poked Xuanmin in the back, as if a mere prodding would cause the monk to collapse right then and there. "You must still be half asleep," Xuanmin replied. He'd felt a fleeting bit of surprise and discomfort, but it would be disingenuous to say he was stunned. Xuanmin had lived for a fair amount of time, and he'd never once experienced what it was to be truly dumbfounded. Xuan scrutinized him for a moment but found no trace of fear whatsoever. His massive head thudded upon his claw with a dull thump. "You, bald donkey, are the most boring person I've ever met," Xuan said in a lifeless monotone. "I've never seen anyone like you." Having failed to scare the person he'd wanted to scare the most, thus missing out on his chance to make Xuanmin lose his composure, Xuan felt a wave of tedium wash over him. Even the initial shock and anger at seeing his own bone faded. He swiped a claw at the short man's hand, and the white dragon bone sword clattered to the ground. He picked it up. The moment he saw the intricate patterns carved into the sword, his anger flared up again. Who the hell did this guy think he was? How dare he? Xuan was too furious to look at the sword any longer. With a surge of heat from his right forefoot, the sword melted as if burned by flames, seeping into his body through the sole of his foot. All that remained was a faint, smoldering warmth at the tips of his claws. But he felt a twinge of regret after absorbing the sword. The heat coursed through his meridians, pooling in his spine, where it caused his immense discomfort. The sensation of warmth and swelling, which had only just started to subside, returned with a vengeance. Unfortunately, his head was too large right now. He couldn't roll around, let alone rub against the gaps between Xuanmin's fingers to cool down. After a moment's hesitation, he subtly moved the front half of his body. In an instant, Xuanmin was enveloped on all sides by Xuan's enormous figure. The dragon had silently coiled around him, trapping him in the center. Xuanmin looked up. "Why are you rubbing against me?" Xuan glanced down at him in disdain, then turned his head away and said with feigned gravity, "I'm borrowing your coolness. If I catch fire, you'll be doomed too." Things hadn't been so bad when the dragon was tiny. He'd only burned the area around Xuanmin's hand. Now that Xuan was the size of a house, him coiling around Xuanmin was like wrapping the monk in 7 or 8 layers of cotton padding, encircling him with fire pits, and smothering him with a heavy quilt. Deeply uncomfortable, in other words. Xuanmin's gaze inadvertently fell on the bundle of clothes in his hand. Xuan, turning his head back, followed his line of sight. Wonderful. He was still naked. Xuan's face remained expressionless in contemplation. He hadn't cared about such trivial matters when he was half-conscious earlier. Touching something cool had felt like grabbing a lifeline. Who cared if he was clothed or not? He wasn't even in human form. Nevertheless, screw it. I'm hot, and I'm still not in human form. With that thought, Xuan shamelessly rubbed against Xuanmin a couple more times. Xuanmin was flabbergasted. Just because Xuan had spent time living among humans didn't mean he had truly become one of them. Dragons might have been divine, but they were beasts at heart. His temperament carried a certain raw, unbridled wildness. When he was hot, he needed to stop being hot. Comfort came first. Everything else could wait. He maintained an air of righteous confidence, but his eyes flicked toward Xuanmin. If he wasn't mistaken, a faint wave of discomfort flashed over Xuanmin's face, so quick it was almost imperceptible. Then Xuanmin frowned. Frowned. Xuanmin rarely showed much emotion. He only frowned when he encountered something dirty or troublesome. In short, it was usually a sign of disgust or distaste. Xuan froze, struck by an inexplicable pang of discomfort. It was as if a line of spiders were crawling across his chest, their tiny legs prickling unpleasantly. The scorching heat that had overwhelmed him seemed to drop away all at once. Well, it became more tolerable, at least. Xuan's coiled body relaxed, leaving some space around Xuanmin. It was unusual for someone so unruly to turn considerate. Xuanmin glanced at him in surprise, only to see that Xuan was focused on the short man lying unconscious on the ground. Perhaps it was the sheer intimidation of his enormity, or simply that a dragon's face wasn't built to express emotions. Now that Xuan wasn't clinging to Xuanmin, he radiated an air of aloofness that made him seem more like a real dragon than ever. "Not hot anymore?" Xuanmin asked blandly. "There's no other movement coming from inside the house. He's probably alone, but he's unconscious, so questioning him will be difficult." Said Xuan. Without another word, he summoned a bolt of lightning from the sky. It struck with tremendous force, hitting the ground between the short man's sprawled legs and fracturing the floor into a network of cracks. Under the threat of castration, the short man jolted awake. Spare me, he cried. "I'm just a humble stonemason. I've done all the work I was supposed to do, and I'll keep my mouth shut about what I shouldn't say. Please, just let me live. The short man was none other than Shr-toe Jahng. Before he'd even fully opened his eyes, he began babbling a string of words. It was clearly something he'd mentally rehearsed for a long time. However, once he came to his senses and found himself under the silent gaze of a massive black dragon, his words faltered. He swallowed the rest of his sentence, and his face turned ashen. "Don't stop now. Keep going," Xuan said, his voice as cold as a river in the depths of winter. As he spoke, another bolt of lightning descended from the sky. Its white light froze in midair, just above Shr-toe Jangh's head. The short man was so terrified that his thoughts poured out like a flood. "What I said earlier was all nonsense. I didn't mean any offense to you two. I've just been hounded by debt collectors for months and had no choice but to lock myself in the house. And I learned a trick to set up a flimsy array from a Taoist priest, hoping to buy myself a few days of safety. Great Immortal, please spare me." "You expect me to believe that?" Xuan sneered. "If you were being pursued by ordinary debt collectors, why would you need to set up an array to block them?" Shr-toe Jahng trembled, too afraid to respond. "A question. Where did the dragon bone and that sword you were holding come from?" Xuanmin cut in abruptly, reminding Xuan of the main issue at hand. Dragon bone?" Shr-toe Jahng looked as if he had been struck by lightning. He repeated in a breathless whisper, "Dragon bone?" When his eyes met Xuan's, he nearly wet himself again. The thought that he'd unknowingly brought back the bone of a real dragon, meticulously carved it into a sword and polished it, and even engraved designs on it? Ancestors above, how am I still alive? Shr-toe Jiang's eyes rolled back. He was about to faint again when a cold, threatening voice stopped him. If you close your eyes, don't expect them to open again. I honestly didn't know it was... I just have a knack for spotting things others can't, Shr-toe Jiang stammered. That time I saw a glimmer in the soil and couldn't resist digging it up. I found the bone and thought it was something special, maybe a spiritual relic, so I brought it back. People say sharp objects can ward off evil, so I carved it into a sword for protection's sake. Under Xueshan's piercing gaze, Shr-toe Jiang's voice grew quieter and quieter. Where did you dig it up? On the mountain by the river. Must you drag this out word by word? Xueshan's patience was wearing thin. Do you need me to give you a little encouragement? No need. Shr-toe Jiang was on the verge of tears. I was blindfolded the entire way. They only removed the blindfold when we arrived. There were no markers on the mountain, so I can't pinpoint where it was exactly. I just remember being able to see the river from the mountain. The river was narrow and swift. The sound of its waves was terrifying. Xueshan was so furious he nearly fell over. The lightning hovering above Shr-toe Jiang's head crashed down with a loud bang, narrowly missing him. Shr-toe Jiang was too scared to move. He stood stiff as a coffin board, tears streaming down his face. What were you taken there to do? Xuanmin asked. They had me carve 7 stone locks and 2 tomb guardian beasts. Shr-toe Jiang was as pale as a ghost as he answered. Xuanmin nodded in understanding and pulled a thin sheet of paper from his hidden pouch, unfolding it in front of Shr-toe Jiang. Was this pattern made by you? Yes. That's what they had me carve. While I was working on it, I could sense the spiritual energy in the pattern, so I asked them about it. They told me it was a longevity talisman, very potent. But where did you get this rubbing, master? That stone lock of yours, Xuanmin replied. It's probably lying at the bottom of the river now. Do you recognize the corpse it was tied to? Corpse? Shr-toe Jiang had clearly never imagined that the stone locks he carved would be attached to a corpse. He shook his head frantically. I didn't know. I just carved what they asked for. When that client came to me, they only said my sculptures had the most spiritual energy. I assumed it was some out-of-town noble who wanted me to carve something for display. I never thought. He hesitated. Anyway, things haven't been peaceful for me lately. It feels like someone wants me dead, but I haven't offended anyone. That incident was the only strange thing that happened to me, so that's why I've been hiding. Xueshan's gaze bore into Shr-toe Jiang, sending chills down his spine. Finally, Xueshan spoke in a cold, detached tone. Did the person who took you to the mountain leave anything with you? Anything? What sort of anything? Anything that has passed through their hands. Shr-toe Jiang was about to shake his head when he suddenly slapped his thigh. Oh, right. There is one thing. What is it? The black cloth they used to blindfold me. I still have it. I didn't dare throw it away. Xueshan snorted. Well done. Shr-toe scrambled into the inner chamber and unearthed a piece of black cloth. It was unclear how long it had been stuffed in there or whether it had been washed. Xuanmin frowned, his face tinged with slight disgust. He was about to find something to use as a barrier to pick up the cloth. Xueshan noticed Xuanmin's expression and, remembering his earlier reaction, reached out with his claw to grab the cloth himself. Taken aback, Xuanmin glanced at him, but Xueshan didn't return the gaze. Let's go, Xueshan said, his tone indifferent. Xuanmin was silent for a moment before asking, Where? To the heavens, Xueshan retorted sarcastically, then turned to Shr-toe Jiang. Stop shaking like a leaf and come with us. If I'm not mistaken, you're planning to return to the Lu residence, Xuanmin observed. Do you intend to go back like this? As he spoke, his eyes swept over Xueshan's massive dragon form. Xueshan blinked. He'd been so angry, he'd almost departed as an entire normal-sized dragon. He couldn't transform back into his compact form in his current state. His meridians, skin, and bones were still swollen with heat, making it impossible for him to shrink that much. If he couldn't transform into a small dragon, his only other option was to take human form. Xuanmin held up the bundle of clothes. ShooANNE grabbed it with his claw, his face set. Just one problem. At his current size, he would not fit in any one room. So, how the hell was he supposed to get dressed, huh? The heavens must have been jealous of his good looks, since they were always playing these jokes on him. Chapter 16. Traveler from Afar. ShooANNE was a dragon who cared deeply about his reputation. Given his lifestyle and the transcendent status he'd held for the majority of his life, at least, that's what he would have told anyone who asked. Still, maintaining his dignity wasn't an unbreakable rule for him. Sometimes he made concessions and ignored his pride. Like when he lounged around, barking orders at that bookworm Jiang Shr-neeng, or when he helped himself to Xuanmin's money. But there were situations where compromise wasn't an option, especially when it came to his image and authority. If he were in good health and had a full set of functional limbs, then being seen naked wouldn't be a big deal to him. He wasn't ashamed of his physique, and he was no ordinary person. It wasn't in his nature to kick up such a fuss about changing clothes. But he was now a paraplegic, and just moving was frustrating. Being naked was one thing, enduring the bald donkey's condescending gaze was another. It would be too much to bear. The mere thought of that scenario made ShooANNE want to grind his teeth. He'd rather be hanged than face someone in such a state. ShooANNE turned his deadpan gaze on Shr-toe Jahng. Hey, do me a favor and kick the bucket for a moment. Shr-toe Jahng blinked. Kicking the bucket meant dying. How could he do that for just a moment? He didn't know what a force to be reckoned with ShooANNE was. Without waiting for a response, ShooANNE summoned 2 bolts of lightning in quick succession, scaring Shr-toe Jahng so badly that his legs collapsed and his eyes rolled back. He had fainted on the spot. Shr-toe Jahng had the courage of a sparrow. Scare him and he'd cry, startle him and he'd faint. He was easy to deal with. Xuanmin was a different story. ShooANNE shot him a dark glare. Tell me, how can I make you faint? I'll try every method. The evil spirit was being unreasonable again. Xuanmin stayed silent. The quickest way to make someone faint was to hit them on the head. ShooANNE raised his claw and waved it back and forth in front of Xuanmin's face, with complete disregard for how Xuanmin might feel about that method. Xuanmin glanced at ShooANNE's stubby dragon claw and pushed it down. A gentleman must conceal his sharpness. Translated into more normal terms, stop waving that claw around. ShooANNE let out a short, cold snort. Huh, who are you to tell me what to do? Nevertheless, he gave up on making Xuanmin faint. He didn't have much control over his strength in his current form. If he miscalculated and struck too hard, they'd be visiting the bald donkey's grave this time next year. It was true, he was annoyed with Xuanmin, but not enough to actually want to kill him. Not getting the chance to make Xuanmin suffer only soured ShooANNE's mood further. He turned his upper body away, no longer interested in bothering Xuanmin, and instead summoned a cloud of mist. A thick white fog gathered around Xuanmin, enveloping him and obscuring his view. ShooANNE swiftly sliced through the knot on the bundle of clothes with his claw, and his massive body was swallowed by a brilliant white light. Though the light was blinding, to Xuanmin it appeared soft and gentle as it filtered through the mist. Within the light, ShooANNE transformed into his human form. Though his body wasn't fully healed, wielding a bit of magic posed no difficulty for a real and mighty dragon. Even while half paralyzed, changing clothes was hardly a challenge. By the time the light began to fade, he was already mostly dressed. Xuanmin had briefly thought about offering to help, but it seemed that was unnecessary. He stood in the frosty winter mist, studied the fading light, and waited patiently. Mist never lasted long. From the moment it enveloped Xuanmin, it began to thin and disperse. By the time the mist had cleared enough to see, ShooANNE was draping a large cloud-like garment over himself. His lean waist and the outline of his shoulder blades flashed briefly as he moved his arms before they were concealed by a black robe. The clothing was simple and plain, without any embellishments or decorations. It made for quite a contrast with ShooANNE's mischievous personality, but it was what he preferred to wear. The ink-black collar accentuated his profile and the visible parts of his neck, rendering them extremely pale, almost sickly. When he wasn't smiling or making trouble, his dark eyes were half-lidded and languid. His black eyelashes cast faint shadows at the corners of his eyes, and his unsmiling lips gave him an air of detachment. He was strikingly handsome, yet a little unapproachable. Perhaps it was the brief glimpse of his pale back or the impassiveness of ShooANNE's profile, a stark contrast to the mocking smile he'd worn while perched on the Liu family's courtyard wall, that caused Xuanmin to freeze for a moment. ShooANNE shifted, his dark eyes flicking over in a sideways glance. The mist had completely dissipated, so he casually tugged his collar shut and hurried to fasten the hidden buttons. Then, as if performing a magic trick, he produced a thin black cord, bit down on it, and used it to tie his hair in a few quick motions. ShooANNE lowered his hands and conjured a gust of wind beneath him for support. With a swift push and flip, the hem of his black robes billowed like clouds before fluttering down. In the blink of an eye, he'd grabbed a wooden chair and sprawled lazily over it. Even when half paralyzed, he couldn't resist striking a pose. Xuanmin wondered what was wrong with him. "Can we go?" ShooANNE tapped the armrest of the chair with his fingers. Said Xuanmin. He took a step forward, as if to reach for ShooANNE. ShooANNE immediately slapped the armrest, causing the chair to screech across the floor and carry him back a good distance. "What are you doing?" he demanded with wide-eyed surprise. Xuanmin dropped his hand. "How else do you plan to get back? Can you walk or fly?" "Huh! I really can fly. What are you gonna do about it?" ShooANNE mentally retorted, though he didn't say it out loud. He couldn't just float through the sky in broad daylight. Doing so would scare the entire county out of their wits. Xuanmin just added fuel to the fire. "Do you plan to summon a gust of wind and bound back, chair and all, like you did earlier?" "Huh! Why did I hesitate back then? I should have swatted this bald old donkey dead and been done with it. That would have spared me his sarcastic remarks, acting so serious when he says them. Bah! Who cares about you?" ShooANNE spat venom in his heart, but his expression was numb. "Fine. Do me a favor and turn around, squat down, and carry me—" Before ShooANNE could finish his sentence, Xuanmin had walked over, bent down, and effortlessly scooped ShooANNE up. One of Xuanmin's hands supported the back of ShooANNE's back, while the other hooked beneath his knees. It was as though Xuanmin wasn't carrying a full-grown man, but cradling a fallen leaf in his palm. "This monk does not squat or kneel, nor does he hunch when walking," Xuanmin said as he straightened up. Forget inside his heart. ShooANNE wanted to spew his guts in Xuanmin's face. "Who are you trying to fool? You squatted just fine when you were digging me up with that rusty copper piece at the Jiang family clinic." But he couldn't afford to kick up a fuss in Xuanmin's arms. If he lost his balance and fell, it'd be horrifically humiliating. ShooANNE held his breath, almost suffocating himself in the process. He glanced around, feeling that this position enfeebled him and stripped him of dignity. His eyes flitted around until he came up with a solution. He grabbed the bundle of clothes, shook out another black robe, and cloaked himself from head to toe. When you are forced into an embarrassing situation, remember one thing: cover your face. ShooANNE was already dressed in black, and now his entire head and face were covered by black fabric. He lay like a corpse in Xuanmin's arms, as if he'd already breathed his last. Xuanmin considered bowing to him in defeat. ShooANNE remained motionless for a moment, then remembered Shr-toe Jahng was unconscious on the ground. He raised a pale, ghostly hand and casually summoned another thunderclap, loud enough to wake everyone within a 10-mile radius. The related bolt struck right beside Shr-toe Jangh's ear, jolting him awake. Shr-toe scrambled to his feet with a mournful expression and slunk over to stand behind Xuanmin. When he saw the figure in Xuanmin's arms, he stumbled again. It took him a while to steady his trembling legs and stand upright. From under the fabric, Xuanmin's muffled voice said, "All set. Let's go." Xuanmin shook his head and strode out of the courtyard. It had to be said that the Wise One's unconventional methods were effective. Hardly anyone dared to glance in Xuanmin's direction. At the sight of the lifeless figure in his arms, people turned away in disgust. They covered their faces and hurried off, unwilling to look for a moment longer. By the time the two men and the ersatz corpse entered the Lu family courtyard, the sky had already darkened. Jiang Shr-neeng had just stepped out of the kitchen and was startled by the cloaked figure Xuanmin was carrying. Having spent more time with ShooANNE than Xuanmin, and being someone who paid close attention to details, Jiang Shr-neeng immediately recognized the hand dangling out from the cloth. Jiang Shr-neeng's hand trembled, and he nearly dropped the lamp he was holding as he rushed over. Fortunately, Xuanmin was quick to explain. "He's alive and well, just pretending to be dead." What? What kind of play is he putting on this time?" Xuanmin didn't answer. He strode into the main hall and placed ShooANNE in a chair beside the square table. Only then did ShooANNE remove the cloth covering his face and let out a long sigh. "I almost suffocated in there." Exasperated, Jiang Shr-neeng set the oil lamp on the table. "You brought it upon yourself. Serves you right." He then rounded on Shr-toe Jahng, his gaze brimming with ghostly energy. "And this fellow is?" Startled by Jiang Shr-neeng's dull and lifeless eyes, Shr-toe Jahng stammered, "Just a stonemason. You can call me Old Zhang or Shr-toe Jahng." ShooANNE pointed to a stone lock leaning against the wall. "Look there. Did you carve it?" Shr-toe Jahng glanced at it and immediately nodded. Yes, it's indeed my work. I recognize it." "So, that's the story," ShooANNE said, shrugging at Jiang Shr-neeng. "He has a connection with the person who set up the tomb on Shr-toe Island, and he happens to have something that person or their subordinate touched. Once Lunienti wakes up, we can have him do a divination. We might uncover some clues." Lunienti?" Jiang Shr-neeng was confused before understanding sank in. "Are you sure he has that kind of ability?" ShooANNE nodded. "I surmise so." He idly played with the flame of the lamp while in his chair. After a couple of flicks, he suddenly slapped the table. "Right, I almost forgot." Jiang Shr-neeng and Shr-toe Jahng had been huddled by the table. At this, they jumped and turned to him, expecting some kind of profound insight. Instead, ShooANNE shot Xuanmin a sidelong glance and said, "What about the meal you owe me?" What nonsense is this?" Jiang Shr-neeng asked. Good heavens, that scared me," Shr-toe Jahng said. Xuanmin gave ShooANNE a look, then turned and strode out of the hall. About 10 minutes later, he returned, calm and composed, carrying a takeout box. His demeanor made it seem like he was holding a lotus flower placed before a Buddhist statue, not food. Jiang Shr-neeng glanced at him and then at ShooANNE seated next to him, still lounging in his chair. Jiang Shr-neeng silently turned his face away. The food box was comprised of 4 layers. There were 6 dishes and a plate of pastries. ShooANNE scanned the table. The porcelain plates were warm, the dishes delicate and beautifully arranged, emitting a faint aroma that was indeed appetizing. But there wasn't a trace of meat in the entire spread. It was all vegetarian. All vegetarian. Had anyone ever seen a dragon survive on grass? ShooANNE rolled his eyes, about to pass out from rage. His old grievances resurfaced, and his frustration with Xuanmin rose yet again. Although Xuanmin's memories were incomplete, his habits remained. He likely hadn't eaten meat in the past, or perhaps he hadn't eaten much at all, which was why he could go days without food and remain perfectly fine. In any case, asking him to buy food meant no meat. Jiang Shr-neeng had to be the one to make another trip and bring back some hearty dishes. In the end, they finally got a proper meal. Aside from the incident 8 years ago, Lu Nianqi had never experienced such suffering. He had been in a deep sleep for 7 days, fluctuating between fever and recovery. Occasionally, when the fever spiked, he would mumble a few words in the middle of the night, sometimes father, sometimes Shiju. Maybe if he didn't open his eyes, the events that had happened wouldn't be real, and those who were gone would still be sitting by his bed, quietly waiting for him to wake up. On the 7th night, just as the night watchman struck his gong, Lu Nianqi's fingers twitched, and he opened his eyes. Because he had been feverish for so long, his eyes were bloodshot. In the light of the oil lamp, they glistened with moisture like he was perpetually on the verge of tears. Jiang Shr-neeng came into the room to trim the lamp wick. When he saw that Lu Nianqi's eyes were open, he asked, "You're awake? Thirsty?" Jiang Shr-neeng called out to the main hall to let them know, then walked to Lu Nianqi's bedside and removed the medicinal cloth from his forehead. He shivered at the cold touch of Jiang Shr-neeng's ghostly body, and the moisture in his eyes spilled over, dampening the corner of the blanket. "Is today the 7th day?" Jiang Shr-neeng paused before he nodded. "Yes, it's the last night." Lu Nianqi covered his eyes with the back of his hand for a moment, then sat up. "Is he still here? I'll spend the last night with him." Jiang Shr-neeng wondered if he was imagining things, but after his long sleep, Lu Nianqi's tone had become uncannily similar to Lu Shiju's. When Lu Nianqi stood up, Jiang Shr-neeng grew even more certain of his suspicions. Lu Nianqi, once so small, had grown a few inches in the 7 days. He no longer looked like a 7 or 8-year-old boy, but someone around 11 or 12. Lu Nianqi felt his way out of the room and nodded listlessly at everyone. Under Jiang Shr-neeng's guidance, he entered the side room, closed the door, and stayed there the entire night. Throughout the night, the side room was completely silent, no crying, no talking. When he'd promised to accompany Lu Shiju, he genuinely meant it. He stayed by his side, without speaking, without clinging to him, just as they'd always been. The next morning, Lu Nianqi emerged from the room, his face pale. He touched the wooden twigs Lu Shiju had left him and stared in Shr-toe Zhang's direction for a long time before saying softly, "Excuse me, could you carve 2 wooden tablets for me?" Although he was a stone mason, Shr-toe Zhang was also capable of working with wood, just not as skillfully as with stone. He was momentarily taken aback but nodded. Xian helpfully explained, "He can't see you nodding." Shr-toe Zhang stared at Lu Nianqi's eyes for a moment. He dared not say too much. "Of course." Having lived in Wolong County for many years, Shr-toe Zhang was somewhat acquainted with the Lu family, even if they weren't close. When he heard Lu Nianqi's request, he understood what he needed. He was a skilled craftsman, so he swiftly whittled out 2 tablets and carved some traditional etchings along the sides. "What should I carve on them?" he asked. "On one, in memory of my late father, Lu Yuan," Lu Nianqi said. Shr-toe Zhang did as instructed and carefully carved out the words. "And the other?" he asked after blowing away the wood shavings. Lu Nianqi fell silent for a long time. What should be engraved on the other one? Lu Shiju's formal name? He hadn't lived long enough to be given one of those, so there was nothing to be carved there. Shiju was just a nickname, one shared by countless others. Using that name in the underworld might lead to confusion. Moreover, Lu Nianqi didn't want to carve Shiju's name. It felt as if doing so would mean his brother, always so aloof, even though he'd given his life for Lu Nianqi, would truly be gone forever. "Forget it. Leave the other one blank," Lu Nianqi said. He took the 2 tablets from Shr-toe Zhang, fumbled through a cabinet for some cloth, and without asking for help, packed some simple belongings and wrapped the tablets inside. tying it securely. He then sat by the square table with the bundle, holding the wooden twigs and facing Xuan. I know what you want. I've known from the moment I opened my eyes. I'll help you with the divination in Shiju's place, though I might not be as accurate as he was. I only ask one thing. Help me bury Shiju. Even if he didn't like relying on others, burying someone wasn't something a half-blind person could do alone. Consider it done, Xuan replied. The black cloth Shr-toe Jiang handed over had been kept in Xuanmin's pouch. Now, they spread it over the table for Lu Nianqi to perform divination with. Lu Nianqi's eyes were clouded and misty as he stared at the black cloth. He sprinkled a handful of fine soil onto the table and slowly traced out patterns with the wooden branch. His movements and expression bore an uncanny resemblance to Lu Shiju's, as if two souls resided within one body. When he finished, he gently touched the soil, frowning a little in thought. I'm afraid I don't have Shiju's spiritual acuity. I can only tell that the person you're looking for is currently on the other side of the river. I can see the general appearance of their location, but I can't pinpoint the exact spot. We might have to go there to find it. He smoothed out the soil on the table and performed the divination again, to the same results. However, he didn't seem surprised by this. He patted the bundle on the table and spoke. If you don't mind an extra burden, I can go with you. After all, he had no living relatives in Wolong County. Without family, his roots were severed, and it made no difference where he lived. Someone who could discern the origins of objects could naturally be a valuable addition to the group. He'd already spent considerable time in Wolong County and couldn't afford to keep delaying. So, in the dim morning light, they buried Lu Shiju beside Lu Yuan's grave. Lu Nianqi knelt before the grave, bowing his head to the ground, 3 times on each side. Then he brushed the dirt from his clothes with a calm expression, shouldered the memorial tablets, and set off with Xuanmin and the others. When they boarded the passenger boat to cross the river, the sky was overcast, and a heavy snow began to fall. The fine snow alighted on the nameless new grave in the mountains and on the top of the black awning of the lone boat. It blanketed both the underworld and the bustling mortal realm. It was a grand farewell, bidding goodbye to both the nameless ghost and the traveler embarking on a distant journey. Perhaps this was the deepest expression of yearning and reluctance to part that could be expressed by humans. You're gone, but it's all right. I'll become you and carry you with me. From this moment onward, time would never trouble them again. They would traverse the same path through countless mountains and share the same boat across endless waters. Alrighty, everyone, that concludes the reading of the first 2 chapters in Copper Coins Volume 2. Also, these are the only 2 chapters in Arc 3, Nameless, so when we meet again, it will be for Arc 4. I hope you all enjoyed these opening chapters. Please let me know your thoughts and reactions in the comments section, and ShooANNE-Mean.